Good evening. On behalf of the Community Design Center of Rochester Board of Directors, supporters, and staff, I'd like to welcome you to the 18th Annual ReShaping Rochester presentation series. It's such a pleasure to see all of you gathered here this evening. My name is Karen Nozick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Community Design Center of Rochester. This year's theme is Then and Now, because although this is the 18th season of our lecture series, this is actually the Community Design Center's 20th anniversary year. As most of you know from attending and participating through the years, we've had some amazing guest lecturers who have shared their wisdom with our community. We thought it would be a treat to bring back some of our previous speakers to give their impressions of what has changed for the better and what still needs work. Each year through our lecture series, the Community Design Center aims to open dialogue around urban planning, design strategies, and issues of equity that contribute to the revitalization of our region. As mentioned, the Community Design Center of Rochester was founded in 2003, and this year we celebrate 2 decades of service to the greater Rochester region. The Design Center promotes the creation of vibrant, equitable, and resilient communities by marshaling the resources of the design community and by engaging, educating, and empowering stakeholders. Many thanks go to the Design Center's board members for their continuing commitment, guidance, and support. Please give a round of applause to this hardworking bunch. President Bill Price, past President Monica McCullough, Treasurer Stephanie Anu-Ziata, Secretary Vanessa Villeneuve, Howard Decker, Jean Dupre, Eugenio Marlin, Michael Pratico, Pamela Reese-Smith, Miriam Yacoub, and Tanya Zuelin. Many of them are here tonight, so please thank them. We appreciate the support of individuals and businesses in our community. Our circle of friends is made up of people and businesses who have donated $500 or more to our organization. A big thank you goes out to everyone on this list. We extend an invitation to any of you who value the work of the Design Center to join our circle. We depend on support from the community to keep our work going, and we really could not do it without you. A big thank you goes out to this year's gold sponsor, ESL. Their continuing support makes it possible for the Design Center to bring these lectures to Rochester. And we would like to recognize and thank the New York State Council on the Arts, who has made our work possible through their generous support. Special thanks tonight goes to the Memorial Art Gallery for hosting us and for producing this lecture series in partnership with the Design Center, and to our exclusive media sponsor, WXXI, for continuing promotional support. Thank you to the Courtyard by Marriott for providing accommodations to our guest lecturers, to Hinge Neighbors for hosting breakfast for our guest presenter, to the City of Rochester, Development Advisors, Hevron and Company, and the other local businesses and organizations who continue to support our work. Thank you to AIA and APA Rochester for offering professional development credits for licensed and certified professionals. And now it is my pleasure to introduce today's featured speaker, Laurie Volk. Laurie Volk first spoke to our group in 2007. She is the principal in charge at Zimmerman Volk Associates, an expert in real estate market analysis, and her unique research methods and approaches to geodemographics has propelled her firm to national prominence. Laurie has conducted more than 120 downtown studies across the country in cities ranging in size from Petersburg, Virginia, to Detroit, Michigan. She served for 4 years on the board of directors of the Congress of the New Urbanism and for 2 years as its chair. She was a founding board member, now emeritus, of the National Charette Institute, served on the board of governors of the Seaside Institute and the advisory board of the Remaking Cities Institute. Laurie was also a member of the Technical Advisory Group for Location and Planning of the U.S. Green Building Council and has been an instructor on market analysis for the Center for Urban Redevelopment Excellence at the University of Pennsylvania. Her international credentials for observations of consumer and economic trends as a writer and researcher for the Times of London and as a member of the prestigious Insight team of the Sunday Times keeps her and her team very busy. Please give a very warm return welcome to Laurie Volk.
Thank you very much, Karen, and I'm delighted to see you all here. I am really pleased to be back in Rochester. I've been here several times since 2007, but I have to say, between then and now, the world has been turned upside down. So what I said then no longer really holds to what is happening in the world today. One of the mantras that our firm has now is that housing is economic development. Back in the old days, cities were just looking for new businesses, new retailers, and housing they really didn't give much thought to. Today, you have to be thinking about housing because some cities, that's the only economic development opportunity they have, building new houses to try to attract some new residents to their towns. So it's very, very important. Housing today has become one of the main issues of our time. So as Karen mentioned, we have been in business since 1988. We do residential studies only. We have opinions on retail and all the other uses, but our specialty is housing. And I personally have led more than 120 downtown studies, and it's amazing to me that some of the same challenges appear over and over from downtown, whether it's large or small. And some of the same opportunities are also there as well. And housing is really one of the best opportunities that so many cities have. Housing is the anchor of a vibrant downtown, a vibrant city, and a vibrant region. You cannot have a hole in the donut for the rest of the donut to survive. It's important when you're looking at housing to understand the market. Who is the market for new housing or adaptive reuse of existing buildings? You want to be able to attract the people that you know really want to live there. So over the years, we developed a methodology which we call target market analysis. And what that does is it looks at market potential, not market demand. You say, well, what's the difference? Well, for us, if you're looking at market potential, you understand that in any given area, people are moving from one place to another, from a rental to an ownership unit or the other way around, from a high-rise to a single-family detached house. If you can understand who are those people that are moving in and out of a city, what their housing preferences are, what their financial capabilities are, what life stage they're in, because we know what life stage that you're in has a big impact on the kind of housing you would choose, you can actually develop a housing program that will correspond to those households. So we are not doing market studies on behalf of the developer, even though we have probably half our clients are developers. Our studies reflect the consumer market, people who will be living in those housing units, what their preferences are, not what the developer thinks he can or she can do. And that makes a big difference then in what kind of housing gets built and how much it's going to cost for the consumer. So our methodology, and I was asked to explain what I do because it is very, very different from any other firm. We use a lot of very reliable data sources like the Internal Revenue Service, who actually takes the data from all your tax returns, and if you move in a given year, they jot it down, and they keep track of in-migration and out-migration on a county basis. And we usually get the most recent 5 years so we can understand where households are moving from when they're moving into a place that we're looking at and where they're moving to. And it's very helpful. And we also get some real numbers. But that's only on the county basis. And most of our work is in cities. So to understand what's happening in a city, we get data from the American Community Survey. And that's part of the surveys that the Census Bureau does every year and every 5 years. And it tells us that same data on a city basis. And actually, you can take it down to a zip code or a neighborhood or even one city block. And that's very helpful for us then to understand the number of people that are moving within or to a city or a neighborhood. And these are all the questions that our studies answer, and it's very useful for both cities to understand what kind of housing they should be seeking to have built or renovated, and for developers who are trying to build something that will be a success. So in 2007, which was 16 years ago, this is what the front page of our study looked like: residential market potential of downtown Rochester. And one of the questions we asked then, because it was very common when you went into a city and into a downtown, when people would say, well, why would anyone want to live in downtown Rochester? Or why would anyone want to live in downtown Atlanta? I mean, city after city, nobody could understand who would want to live in a downtown. So the first part of the presentation is persuading you that there's a lot of reasons why people would want to live here. There's beautiful, historic, and very diverse architecture throughout the downtown here in Rochester. It's an employment center, and the type of employment has changed dramatically over the years, but Rochester keeps attracting new businesses. It's a cultural and entertainment center, and that's especially important for young people, whom you will see are really make up the heart of the housing market in downtown. There are places to eat and drink. Now, the pandemic has had an impact on those spaces, but they're coming back, and more will come back the more housing we build. And unlike so many cities across the country, you have a beautiful river that runs through it. Some years ago, we did a downtown study in Birmingham, Alabama, and they have no water in Birmingham. And they were thinking, how can we focus our downtown? You can focus a downtown on a river or all kinds of different natural amenities, but without a river, what they were going to do? Well, they were a shipping center via rail. And they had all of these railroad tracks that went just about across the middle of the city. So they decided to call it their River of Steel. And they built parks. Of course, there's no longer trains running on these railroad tracks. So they built parks and housing, and that has become their river. So you have to be creative sometimes, but you were lucky. You already had a river. So we looked at Rochester then, back in 2007, and then last year we did a study in downtown Rochester because the city received a grant of $10 million from the state to upgrade and improve a very specific part of downtown. And we were a member of that team. So looking at some of the comparisons of what happened, what was going on then and now, just in terms of the number of households, even though you had been losing a lot of households prior to 2007, between 2007 and 2022, you gained about 5,000 households. And now your household population is almost 90,300. And that's really great. And when we determined what the annual market potential, that's those households that have the potential to move either within or to the city of Rochester. We determined that in 2007, each year there are approximately 17,250 households that have that potential to move within and to the city. And I remember people being astonished at the number. But mobility is very high in the United States, although it has been dropping. However, in 2022, it had grown to over 19,000, almost 200. Now, who lived in terms of life stage in Rochester in 2007? Empty nesters and retirees made up about 20% of the households of the city. Families were the largest single life stage at about 46% of all households living in the city at that time. And young people, singles and couples, were about 34%. Now you look at 2022, and you can see that the mix of households by life stage has changed quite significantly over that 16-year period. Empty nesters and retirees have dropped to 13% of all households. Families have dropped to 28% of all households. And look where the growth has been in young people, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. Median household went up. However, the median national income in 2007 was higher than the median income in Rochester in 2022. So there needs to be, we keep talking about all the things that need to happen. Well, one thing I really believe is that incomes need to go up. We can't expect everything to all the time rise in this and incomes don't. But it's a struggle because it really depends upon what your workforce is. And obviously, also the median housing value went up. And again, the median housing value in 2007 is higher than what the median housing value in the city of Rochester is in 2022. Now, the ownership rate has also dropped from 40% to 37%. 37% is still fairly high for a city. We have found that ownership rates in cities are generally much lower than in suburbs, and that's because a lot of the people, particularly in downtowns, who move to a city or a downtown are much more mobile. If they get a job offer somewhere else, they want to be able to move rapidly rather than having to sell an existing house, go through the whole process of moving and all that. So it's not all that upsetting unless you see that there are neighborhoods that once were all home ownership, and now you see that it's turned to being at least a third rental as well as ownership, and that trend keeps increasing. So the migration dynamics here in the city and in New York State, and actually in all of the Northeast, shows that more above average migration is within the city and within the state and within the region, and lower than average migration is people moving in. And I think that that's pretty clear to us today. We know that every time there's a blizzard in Buffalo, if you look at the migration, you see thousands of people moving to Florida. And it's very unfortunate. I personally like 4 seasons, but it is a dynamic that is not just local, it is regional. It is the entire Northeast region is facing this challenge. So the city's housing market today is now dominated by singles and couples of all ages. And that's something that you really have to understand is one of the big changes, because America once was a land of families. When the baby boomers were in their younger years and married and having children, married couples with children represented more than 45% of all American households. Today, that number is down, that percentage is down to 22%. So there's, as I said, the world has been turned upside down. And one of the reasons is because we now have a lot of generational change. We have always been interested in what the impact of each individual generation has had on the housing market. And the millennials have been the stars for the last 10, 15 years. They're now, the leading edge of the millennials are now in their middle 40s, and even though we all thought they would never have kids and never get married, they are actually forming family households and having children. They are not moving out at the same rate that the baby boom did when they had kids, and they're having a real struggle with home ownership. Some have been able to actually buy houses before all of the prices started soaring and all of the interest rates started rising. But for the most part, millennials have been renters. They are now, the next generation after them, we call the Zoomers. And the leading edge of this generation is in their middle 20s. And I sometimes think that these kids were born with one of those cells in their brains, because if you have a question about anything to do with technology, they know it off the top of their heads. And if you don't have a Zoomer in your office, you're in trouble. And I read not long ago a very interesting article, because these kids are really very intense. And it was talking about, with a lot of laughter, that the millennials that share offices with Zoomers are actually afraid of the Zoomers. And I thought, well, isn't that something for the millennial generation to take in? Anyway, they are going to have more and more impact on the housing market. As you can see here, this chart, I hope you can see, shows the 4 principal generations and what their percentage of all persons aged between 18 and 84, and how over the next 20 or some years, the millennials, the blue line, which is clearly the dominant line today, stay pretty much in ascendance until the Zoomer generation catches up and surpasses them. And of course, the baby boomers, and we used to think that we were the center of the world, by 2044, oh well. So it won't be the baby boomers ruling the world anymore. As I mentioned, millennials and Zoomers are primarily renters. And a lot of that has to do with the load of college debt that they carry if they've gone to college. And just being able to put together a down payment is challenging if your salary isn't enough to pay for a monthly rent, and save money to put down on purchasing a house. And those that may have gotten enough together for a down payment and figured very carefully how much they could afford to pay, when the interest rates shot up from 3% to over 6%, there went their dreams of buying a house. They could no longer afford that monthly payment. So it's interesting, when we look back in 2007, that was also the year the iPhone was introduced. Think about that. Before the iPhone, what did we do before smartphones? When you look at what has happened in those 16 short years, social media has taken over, both negatively and positively. It was supposed to change the world, and it really has. Maybe not always in the best way. Entertainment is now available on your phone or even your watch. You no longer need a bookcase because you read books on your phone. You no longer need a CD player. You listen to music via Spotify, so you don't even have to buy CDs anymore. You just subscribe to Spotify and get all the music you ever want. Subscriptions have become the thing, particularly in the younger generation. We know of several housing projects in a number of cities where you actually subscribe to the housing. It's not paying rent. You pay a subscription, and then you can go from one to another. What you get is a bedroom with a bathroom and a shared living room and a shared kitchen, but it works just fine for young people. I wouldn't really care for it, but, I'm much older than that. Transportation. Listen, you can get an Uber or a Lyft using your phone. You can rent a bike using your phone. You don't need much else than your phone if you're in your young shopping online. Part of the problem of what's happened to retail across the United States. Digital first. You want to buy something? What's the quickest way to do it? You go on Amazon. They sell everything. So that leaves the baby boom slowly but surely retiring and becoming less of an impact on the housing market, less in control of what kinds of amenities they want to see in a downtown and what kind of spaces they're looking for. And finally, Generation X. I've gotten complaints many times because I've used to just talk about millennials and baby boomers because they were the two largest generations that made up the downtown housing market. And one day someone said, well, I'm Generation X and I live in the city. And I said, really, that's a very important point. Generation X, unlike the baby boom, did not leave the city when they had children. They didn't head out to the suburbs. A lot of them stayed in not downtowns, but in those wonderful in-town neighborhoods that are not far from downtown. In several cities that we've visited, they actually worked on the local public school to make it so that all the kids in the neighborhood could go there. They were very involved and very committed. So without Gen X, I don't know where cities would be today. So downtown's target markets are a mix of younger singles and couples. Almost 2/3 of the downtown housing market are young people. Empty nesters and retirees, a mix of both Gen X, who are becoming empty nesters, and baby boomers, and then a very small percentage of families with children. So then and now, again, we have very different annual market potential. It's increased by over 2,000 households. And again, you see a very dramatic change in who that market is for downtown. Back in 2007, there was a much higher percentage of empty nesters and retirees, baby boomers. And families were still a part of the downtown market because they were looking at surrounding neighborhoods. And young couples, they were a plurality, but not a majority. And so you can see that it has just changed dramatically over those 16 years. And when we forecast absorption back in 2007, we said that the downtown should be able to capture every year approximately 133 to 263 rental and for sale units per year. And often cities don't quite make that absorption forecast. But when I see all the new housing that has happened, you probably got pretty close. Well, now we think that with the resurgence of downtowns, with the improvements that you have made, that about 300 to 400 new housing units, primarily rental, could be developed in the downtown each year over the next 5 years. So part of it is that you need to have increased housing choice because you want to have a diversity of households living in your downtown. You don't want just all young people and all old people. You want a mix of both incomes as well as life stages. So what are the main issues that are facing downtowns and cities in general today? There are millions of them, but from a housing perspective, so many of them have been accelerated because of the 2 solid years that we spent hiding out in our houses, afraid to actually get together with other people for fear of catching COVID. So the pandemic has taken some of the changes that were already happening before and accelerating them and exaggerating them. So we now have a huge issue across the country of housing affordability. We have offices that are vacant. It's hard to fill them up. An empty retail space. Downtown is not the same as it was 16 years ago because of all the ravages that the pandemic wrought on the downtown. So this graph, I think, shows pretty clearly what's happened in terms of ownership and the gap between what people can afford to pay based on what the median income is and the national median income and what the national median housing value is. And in a lot of cities, that gap is even wider. So there are very few people who can buy the median value house, even if they have the median housing income, because it no longer covers the cost. The housing has shot up so dramatically in terms of values, both rental and for sale, and incomes, although they've grown in the last 16 years, they have not in any way kept up. And what we're seeing now, which is really disturbing, is that not only are the lower income workers have left because of housing affordability, but now cities are beginning to lose their college graduates. And you can see from this graph that Rochester has been losing college graduates a net loss in the first 5 years of the study period from 2010 to 2014 of 3,000 college graduates, dropping down to 1,000 in the next 5-year time frame. And then the pandemic wrecked all the progress you made. And that's because housing affordability. What's happening is you don't have to be poor and not be able to afford housing. You can be middle income and you can't afford housing. It is quite shocking how everything has changed so much in 16 years. Housing then has to become economic development. You have to build housing that people can actually afford to rent or buy and live in. Because if you don't, the city is going to finally crumble. You have to keep renewing the housing stock. And that means expanding housing choice, not just single-family detached houses. America is very attached to single-family detached houses, but the housing market today isn't necessarily looking for single-family detached houses. We call it the 62% mismatch. 62% of all US households contain just one or two people. Not 4, not 3, 1 or 2. And in cities like Rochester, that percentage is even higher. It's 71% of all the households living in the city. They're not families, it's 1 or 2 people. 62% of all US housing units, old and new, are single-family detached. Now, why is that happening? Does that seem like a match of who households are and what is being built? I mean, this is actually a house being built outside of Rochester. Nationally, now we're looking at national numbers now, 2/3 of the housing market who buy houses are not families. They're 1 or 2 person households. So we argue that we have to start looking at a wider range of housing types to give people more choice. Not everyone wants a house of 2,000 square feet. We're looking at what we call missing middle housing types. This is a drawing done by Opticos Design, an architect and planning firm based in California, but it shows the two ends of the type of housing that most cities have. On this end, it's the 70 to 80% single-family detached houses, and on that end are all of the multifamily buildings typically found in downtown. Certainly, we need far more neighborhood-scale buildings that have multiple units that fit within the single-family context so that we can increase density. And why do you want to increase density? It brings more people. It attracts more people. People like people. and you need more density to support the retail. So one of the housing types that we think is very effective is what we call a mansion apartment building. It can look like a single-family detached house, but it actually is 6 to 8 rental apartments, or it could be 6 to 8 condominiums. We have talked about this housing type over and over again, and we actually were doing a study in South Bend, Indiana, on a neighborhood where several foundations had been buying up the existing housing stock, which was beautiful, beautiful 1920s and 30s houses. You know, buying the houses, spending $250,000 to $300,000 to fix them up, but because they were getting the money from the city, they had to sell them at a reduced price of $90,000 to $120,000, which is a huge gap between what it costs to build and what you can actually sell it for. And I said to the foundation heads, I said, how long can this go on? I mean, at some point, you have to be able to get a little bit closer. And so they were very interested in the idea of being able to do different building types, townhouses on the center of the block where there are 3 lots that are vacant. Instead of doing 3 single-family houses, you could do 6 townhouses. They could be ownership so that people who own on that block don't get upset that you're introducing rentals. But on every intersection, every corner was a large lot, typically vacant, because people didn't like those houses because traffic was zipping by. That's where we suggested that they do these mansion apartment buildings. So everybody was all excited, and then they looked at their zoning. Guess what? The only housing type allowed in that neighborhood were single-family detached houses. So they have since undertaken a complete revamping of their zoning to make it accommodate a greater variety of housing, because that is so important. Because the market for single-family detached houses, there are still plenty of people who want that detached house, but there are plenty of people who want something else. Converting upper floors into housing, particularly the smaller buildings that are usually located on the edge of downtowns or in neighborhoods, and often are just vacant. When we did a study in Northeast Indiana, an 11-county region anchored by Fort Wayne, there were lots of these charming little towns with buildings just like that, all empty on the upper floors. And the interesting part of this assignment was that manufacturing had come back with a roar in this part of the state. And they had 6,000 manufacturing jobs that they couldn't fill because nobody could find any housing to live in. So housing definitely becomes economic development, because you don't get those jobs if you don't have the housing for the people to live in. So we suggested that they establish in all those little towns an upper floor program. And the regional agency decided to run that and hired an architect who would help building owners that wanted to convert. And it'll have a beneficial effect on those little downtowns, because now they'll have people walking on the street, and that will help their retail as well. Housing affordability, I have to say, has really gone insane. What's happened, instead of having an income pyramid where you have a few extremely wealthy people, and most of us are at the bottom with not that much money, it has now turned into an hourglass. And we first noticed this about 10 years ago in cities, that what used to be a fairly solid middle class, a few were going up in income, but most of them were falling down into lower incomes because the incomes were just not keeping up. And so what you had was a great hollowing out of the American middle class in so many cities. So being able to produce housing for that middle income group where there aren't any kind of federal programs that will subsidize construction of that housing, and most developers are may only be looking at market rate, it's really important because we can't lose our middle class. That's been the stable part of our country for so long. So it's really critical that that other missing middle is addressed as well as the missing middle of housing types. High office vacancies, one of the challenges of downtown. The national median office occupancy rate is now down to 50%. And I remember in the last recession, the occupancy rate had dropped to 70%. And everybody was shocked and forecasting the death of our downtowns. Well, that was actually pretty good compared to what the situation is today. And of course, we now have what we call the new live work, where employees are just refusing to go back to the office. A lot of that has to do with the length of their commute. Now, someone mentioned to me that the commute here isn't very long. It may be 15 minutes, but if it used to be 10 minutes and now it's 15 minutes, proportionally, that's a big increase. It doesn't have to be the hour-long commute that a lot of people make into the city of New York. It's what you're used to and what you expect. And another then rationale for converting some of those office buildings, which is what we recommend that you analyze the office buildings that you have, particularly B and C buildings, because those sometimes are more able to be converted than some of the newer buildings, and convert them to office, because then you can have people who may work downtown, now they can walk to work and they don't have a commute at all. And that's really important. And once again, you're not attracting more businesses, but you've maybe creating more housing. And maybe you can create, with this redevelopment of office buildings, a wider range of incomes and rents and prices for people, so that it's not just all low income and it's not all high income, but it spans the spectrum. And empty retail spaces, until they have customers, it's going to be a real challenge. And right now, the diminishing supply of office workers in a downtown is not providing the type of support that most retail establishments require. Plus, along with everything else, what retail needs is very different from what it used to be 16 years ago. We found that with mixed-use buildings, you plan to hope to have retail on those ground floors, but often that's not going to happen until you get more people living downtown. So a lot of our developer clients have begun putting the building amenities on that ground floor. They put the fitness center on the ground floor, and that looks like, a gym. And most young people really enjoy working out in public like that. It's kind of odd, but we found that that's a very popular use of ground floor space. Also, you can use it for co-working spaces. A lot of the new apartments have very small units, and it's hard to set up workspace. If you set up co-working spaces in that ground floor, it looks like an office, and it's actually then at some point, when there are enough people back living and working in downtown, retail will come back. Which is why we also recommend that a lot of times buildings that we hope become mixed use start out as all residential. It's quite easy on that ground floor to develop what we call these maisonette apartments, which are essentially a little bit taller than a normal apartment, and it has a loft bed, very appealing to young people. And until retail demand comes back, it works very well as a residential unit. But what if you get a lot of people living back in downtown and you want that retail space back? It can convert very easily. So that is key when you're building a mixed-use building, to remember to keep spaces on the ground level flexible, to be able to adjust to what the economic conditions at the time are. And experiential retail is really what has become what's happening now in so many cities across the country. Stores will put on websites a tour of what they're offering. And so you can go on your phone and travel around the store, and if you see something you like, you can have them set it aside. An even more immersive experience is the one on the right, which is a store in Manhattan, of course, where they're selling mattresses. Now, each of those pods obviously has a mattress inside, and potential buyers can spend $25 and actually sleep in the pod on that mattress for a half an hour before they decide to make their purchase. So it's an experience. Downtown housing, I'm sure you're all aware of this, provides major support for retail and restaurants. Some of our earliest downtown studies were done at the behest of the downtown retailers because they said we cannot survive on 9-to-5 workers. We need people in the downtown all the time. And that requires having people live downtown, making downtown a neighborhood. So the challenges today to housing development, and it's not just limited to downtowns, but most developers do try to go where development process is easiest. Because right now we've got costs skyrocketing: land, labor, materials, financing. It's all going up, 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 and incomes aren't keeping up. And then when you add on top of it a challenging approvals process, and I heard some pretty interesting stories about what goes on in Rochester, not unusual. Unfortunately, it happens across the United States. So many cities haven't yet accepted the fact that they need to make it easier to build housing, not harder. So solutions, and these are only a few, are public-private partnerships. I know these happen. Density incentives, that's even better because we want more people living downtown, many as possible. Publicly owned land can be used to bring in a developer for a housing project, which cuts some of the cost down. And more importantly is providing gap financing. Several of the cities that we have worked in have created a gap financing pool by having donations from the county, the city, the banks that are located in the downtown, and major corporations. They did that in downtown Detroit, a $20 million gap financing pool, and they were targeted to 12 buildings in downtown, beautiful old historic towers, gorgeous buildings, but it had been vacant so long that there were trees growing out of the roof. And that money was targeted to developers who would take on those buildings. And that was clearly a huge challenge. But now, about 18 years later, every one of those buildings has been redeveloped. Most are housing, but one is a luxury hotel. So without that financing, which is below interest rate financing, it wouldn't have happened because the gap would have been too big between what it would cost to redevelop those buildings and where the market was in terms of rents. So a vibrant, healthy downtown is what we need to make sure that we have a healthy city and a healthy region. And there are other things that you need to do. You need to continue to emphasize that it's a city, it's not a suburb. You don't want to introduce suburban planning into a core city. You want to emphasize all the amenities and assets of city life. And there are several ways that we have seen that cities do it, and you've done it here. The preservation of the urban fabric. It's important to the history of the city. This is the Annex Mills at High Falls, which won a preservation award, and it's a beautiful property. And that generates pride in people who live in the city. That's part of their history. That's part of what makes them feel rooted here. You need new buildings, but they need to respect the street. They need to respect the urban context. You don't want them set back with parking lots in front, because that doesn't attract anybody. You want a building like this where there's interesting things going on the ground floor. And when you walk by, it's something you want to look at, not something you want to look away from. You want streets that accommodate people who want to walk, people who want to ride the bikes, people who want to ride a scooter, anything as well as cars. And too many downtown streets treat cars as the principal use that gets all of the support. And that is something that's really not inducive to urban life. And finally, placemaking. And I find this Parcel 5 to be a very interesting story. And it was really a place that was made by the people who live here. And it's become an amazing gathering spot for people on momentous occasions. And I think that it's quite wonderful that, I know it was engendered a lot of conflict, but it's also engendered a wonderful place for people who live here to go. So I have to end by saying housing has now become the economic engine that is helping to rebuild downtowns and cities across the country. And it's very important that we keep that in our minds, and that we have to aim to house everyone, not just the rich and not just the poor. It needs to across the spectrum. So that's the end of my presentation, and I'm now ready for questions.
I know there's some questions from this group. Anyone?
How do we get a supermarket downtown?
Oh, I love that question. I can't tell you. We've had all kinds of focus groups with downtown residents, and when I ask them what they want, number one, grocery store. And you know what? You cannot pry a grocery store chain to move downtown. I know of one grocery store chain that actually opened a downtown store in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. And we actually talked to the developer who finally persuaded them to open that store. The dynamics of shopping were completely different. People came in with one bag, got enough for dinner, and went home. But that repetitive visits by people actually engendered more dollars per square foot than the suburban model. But do you think that they would agree to open more in the city? No. And a couple of cities, obviously, if you get enough population in the downtown and surrounding neighborhoods, you will eventually get a grocery store. I know that we've had a lot of involvement in Providence, Rhode Island, and that city has been struggling to come back, just like so many cities across the country. But they've been on a real push for housing, and they have gotten a lot of new units in the downtown. And about 5 years ago, an entrepreneur opened an urban grocery. Well, it was great, but it had very limited stock. And finally, about 6 months ago, we got a Trader Joe's, the beloved Trader Joe's. And it's very interesting because we went to see what was going on there, and it was the same thing. It was people with one bag getting stuff for dinner, and pedestrians. They didn't have very much parking for cars. And it was people from all the surrounding neighborhoods and from the downtown. So it does happen, but they have very strict calculations on how many people they need with an average income of how much. And if you don't have it, they're not coming. It's really sad, but true. Anybody else?
Where's the Trader Joe's?
Wait, I'm sorry.
Where is the Trader Joe's?
Where is it? Well, Providence is, like Rochester getting rid of their inner loop. Providence had an interstate that went right through an area called the Jewelry District. And they decided they were getting it out of there. And they tore it down and rerouted it so that it did not go through any neighborhoods, but joined up with an existing roadway. So that made a lot of land vacant when you took down all the, the overpasses and the roundabouts and all that kind of, road work that engineers love to put in just to get on and off a highway. And what happened is now there's a lot of land. And the Trader Joe's was taking a look at downtown and across the river, which is another neighborhood, very dense neighborhood. There's Brown University, Rhode Island School of Design, and they thought, aha. And I couldn't believe that where it was built, you can't even see it if you drive by it. You have to know it's there. And it's, that kind of news travels. But it took 15 years. It doesn't come in overnight. They calculated how many people there were living in that area, what was the median income, and they figured, okay. And they have said that they're going to open something like 100 new grocery stores in cities around the country. So I would chase them. Microphone? Oh.
So I wonder if your design work and your assessments have evaluated how you balance the density of housing and vibrancy in downtowns with the residential neighborhoods and what the transition between them looks like.
I'm sorry, I missed the last part of that.
What does the transition between the vibrant downtown and the residential neighborhoods look like?
We've got big, tall buildings. Well, it seems to me that what has been done and the part of the inner loop has worked pretty well as a transition from towers, like the Metropolitan in the downtown, which was an office building, to 4-story. And then you can also do, if it's a primarily single-family neighborhood, you can do townhouses and those mansion buildings. I always recommend that it is a range of different housing types, that you don't just stick to just big, tall buildings and single-family houses, especially if it's a single-family neighborhood that adjoins the downtown.
Thank you. The city of Rochester has a long history of segregation, so I'm curious how we can develop with gentrification and housing equity in mind.
I'm having trouble understanding the questions. Did you ask something about gentrification? Yes. Okay, because we were discussing that this afternoon. I actually don't think that gentrification is the issue. I don't know of anybody who doesn't want to live in a neighborhood that's nicer. Instead of having dilapidated buildings, the buildings look nicer. They've got paint on them. Most people really would prefer to live in a nicer neighborhood where you could walk to amenities. The problem is displacement. And that means that you have to be able to devise policies and programs that will help the people who already live there stay there when things get improved. Because as you know, improvements come in, the rents go up, the taxes go up, and pretty soon you can't afford to live in your own neighborhood anymore. So we know that a lot of cities, particularly for older houses over a certain age, usually it's 62, if you make below a certain income and you're in a neighborhood where things are being fixed up, that they will freeze your taxes at the rate that they are now so that you don't get penalized for living in this much nicer neighborhood where the values are going up. And that has helped keep a lot of older people in their houses longer than they would have suspected. It's harder, obviously, to do that with renters. But in Atlanta, we worked on a large project on the west side where Atlanta has a lot of very, very, very rich business people. I mean, the owner of Home Depot, that's him. I mean, they have billions. And they had a steering committee of about 15 of these extremely wealthy people. And when it became quite clear that a lot of the older people in that neighborhood, and it was a lower income series of neighborhoods, were living in dilapidated houses and only paying like $500 a month. And there was no way new construction could accommodate a $500 rent. It was suggested to this steering committee that perhaps they subsidize those units. And after a lot of, bewailing, and they agreed to do it. And so they have managed to keep all of the people that have been living there and wanted to stay in the neighborhood by building new housing that wasn't as dilapidated as some of the housing they were living in, but not raising what they were spending to live there. That, of course, depends on having, that a top number of people that are that wealthy. But again, it was a very large area of just to the west of downtown. And there was a lot of development pressure because in between the downtown and this neighborhood was where all the new football stadium was, and football players were buying up some of the lots in this neighborhood, and everybody was afraid they were going to be driven out. Well, this whole years-long process has managed to address that issue to the satisfaction of everybody in that neighborhood. So it can be done. It takes time. None of this ever happens overnight, unfortunately. And progress when you live here seems to be achingly slow. But if you go away, like I went away and come back after 16 years, you're like, whoa, look at what all has happened here. And a lot has happened here, and a lot of it to the good. And you clearly still have a lot of challenges. Every city does. I mean, we've all been turned upside down by so many different things, but particularly the pandemic has had such a huge impact on how we live. That and social media and the smartphone. But I don't think it's wrong to improve a neighborhood. That's better for people, but you need to be very, very careful about the people who live there and make sure they're not driven out. Where's the microphone somewhere?
Yeah, hi, thanks. I have an adult foster child who's 30, and I have been helping her buy a house. Closing is June 12th. And I've learned a lot through this process. So one question is, one of the things that was not in your slides was single parents. So she's the mother of 2 children, and what you're seeing demographically with that group. But what I've learned that's so interesting is that people, like her friend, very small sample size, her friends, relatives who grew up without financial literacy tend to rely on their IRS refund for any kind of savings. So this year she had $10,000 refund, and I said, this is our chance. So even though the interest rates went up, she's not going to get, we were hopeful that she would have a reduction in rent, not so much, but she will be in a house.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah. And I'm just thinking that there's an opportunity there, like, that I don't know what to do with and who to go to with. But I think there are, I just heard her tell me what her other friends' refunds were. And without financial literacy or access to, one stable adult figure to help them, because it's been shepherding her through this process has required a lot of time. So I don't know, I'm just kind of throwing that out there, but I'm also interested in the demographic question.
Right. Well, obviously that's very helpful to get that size of a refund. That doesn't go very far in some neighborhoods where, a house that used to be valued at $90,000 is now $250,000. I mean, we were just talking about neighborhoods in Washington, D.C., where you could pick up a house on this particular area of D.C. for $90,000. And what's happened in so many young people have been moving in because of the various, it's all the time turnover because of the administration changes. And the housing has just soared. That same unit now is worth 3 times as much as it was. And, you know, that is what so many people freak out over. If you're young, you see a house, oh, I might be able to afford that. Then you figure out what you can pay. And by the time you get finished figuring it all out, the house is no longer affordable because the interest rates went up and so did the price of the house. So timing is everything. And I'm not very good at timing. I'm still in the same house I bought many, many years ago. So I think that there are probably places here that actually help people get through that process. Most cities do. So in the back? Yes.
Hi, Ms. Volk. Can you tell us a little bit about gerrymandering in these neighborhoods that you're talking about? You're talking about building up downtown, talking about people who are living around those areas, and gerrymandering that's going on. It's a lot of it, where neighborhood, the configuration of neighborhoods are changing. And I don't know, sometimes I wonder if they're telling the people who live in those neighborhoods that the changes are being made, or they're just making them, and then you're like telling them at the end of the decision-making? Gerrymandering.
When my plane landed, my ears, and they haven't popped yet, and I'm having real trouble hearing with the echo in
I
here.
was asking you about gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering.
Gerrymandering in neighborhoods that have people who live around them, where the configuration of the neighborhood maps are being changed
Oh,
to
for
be able
voting
to
purposes.
bring in, more affordable housing, well, I don't know about affordable housing, but housing and transforming neighborhoods without the residents really knowing what's going on. Do you know much about that?
Here in Rochester? No.
Well, anywhere.
Well, I mean, obviously that happens a lot of times, but I do think today, again, the world has been turned upside down, that people are much more aware of what's going on in their neighborhood. I think it would be pretty hard to do something significant in a neighborhood where people are actually have been living there for quite some time and can spot when something is different. And, you know, there's now, of course, these next door sites that help you keep in touch with what's going on in your neighborhood. As far as gerrymandering, that's a political thing. Nothing I can do about that. But I do think that, for the most part, a lot of times the planning process goes on without consulting the people of the neighborhood. And a lot of that is they'll hold these meetings and they want you to show up, but most of the people don't show up because they feel like, why should I bother? Nothing will happen that I want to see happen. But that's giving up. And I think everybody, if there's something going on in your neighborhood, you should show up and make your voice heard. I think I could maybe hear better without the microphone. I'll just come over here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I used to be
Right. Look,
What I wanted to know is, what weight does the availability of a parking place for drawing people
Parking
into the
is
city?
overrated.
Well, for a small city like Rochester, a lot of what you're going to want to do is not downtown. I mean, if you want to draw people downtown, to what extent does day-to-day availability off the street, what role does that play in attracting people to
Well,
that
obviously, we
downtown?
hear over and over again that everybody wants to park right in front of where they live or right in front of the store they want to go into. But if it's an attractive streetscape, you don't really mind walking from one end of the block to the other. The problem is too many cities have those vacant spaces, walls. There's nothing there to really be entertaining as you're walking along. What we're finding with this new generation, the Zoomers, is that they have been, as a generation, very reluctant to get a driver's license. I mean, we've done a poll of all the people we know who have children 20, of driving age and above. And it's an astonishing percentage of these young people who just don't want it. They don't want a car. They don't want to drive a car. They want to be able to walk. But this generation, these Zoomers, they use Uber and Lyft. And, if you have rented cars by the day, that works, that used to work. But I think Uber and Lyft has become a real transportation choice for so many young people. And then it's bike share. Of course, in winter, that's not so much fun. But a lot of, again,
We do have your own bicycles.
20s, they're younger. So I do think that we give far too much space to parking and not enough space to people. And I think in the end, we need to redirect what we're thinking about. Cities are for people, not cars. I know they're a necessity, people commute in, but we need to make sure that the priority is the pedestrian, not the car.
Laurie, here. Thank you very much for coming to Rochester again. Here's a simple question. How important is the beauty of a city in attracting Zoomers?
Well, it's clearly very important, and that's the buildings that exist there. I mean, a parking deck is not beautiful, but the buildings you have. I mean, I had a driving tour before, after I landed, and before we came here, and I was stunned again by what beautiful buildings you have. And it's really important to the people who live here that there are, you don't tear down every building that just because it's old, but you make an effort to restore it to health, because it is a part of your history and a part of the downtown. It's really, really, really important. And you've got that river. I mean, so it's beautiful. The high falls is gorgeous. I was so impressed the first time I looked here. I was thinking, why aren't really people moving here? Which brings me to a point. Your city does not do much marketing. And, today you have to market yourself, develop a brand. I don't know anything about that, but who do you brand? I mean, the I Love New York is so iconic. You might some way to tag on to that, because you have so much to offer. And you are a city that would be a place for climate migrants to move to. One day in Florida is going to be all underwater. And all those people who moved down because of the blizzard is going to be moving back. So, anyway, I think it's a beautiful city.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I came because I was intrigued by the title, that housing becomes an economic engine. I work with a population, most of whom would not benefit from that economic engine, namely men and women experiencing homelessness. Some of them have been displaced. Some of them have not found ways to increase their incomes. Some have other problems that are not being met. I would be interested to know if any of your studies have looked at alternatives to market-driven housing that itself engines better economy for a city because it takes away from costs by emergency rooms or police investment, and whether you've seen any mixed housing with social housing in the midst of market-driven housing, or what some people call public housing.
Yes, well, we are very close believers in mixed income housing. And because I think it's important that people learn to live together, not in little enclaves of both poverty and wealth. It needs to be, at least a lot of neighborhoods need to be able for people of a wide range of incomes to be able to live there. It's hard to achieve, particularly when it's all single-family detached houses, which is one reason we advocate all the time to infill different kinds of housing so that you can have housing that appeals to other people. This homeless issue is one that's obvious across the country. Downtowns are experiencing a flood of people who are now unhoused. And we've just finished a study in Duluth, Minnesota, and they have had an especially severe problem. So the city and the county have gotten together and they've come up with a 3-step program. And obviously, a lot of homeless encampments have occurred in various cities that get wiped out. They move around and they go to another place. Well, they decided that the parking lot near this community center that serves all kinds of people would become dedicated to a legal tent city. And it was the appropriate spot because people living there could actually come into the community center and use the services of the community center. So what they learned in the process of dividing this 3-step plan is that there are a lot of homeless people who don't want to live in an apartment or in a building. So another approach has been, particularly for homeless veterans, is to build, you have a sizable enough lot to build a series of micro houses, tiny houses that are, you know.
We're about to do that here.
You do that?
We're about to.
Oh, great. Well, see, and that helps. Every little bit helps. But clearly, there are more issues than just homelessness. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why people become unhoused. We've been in cities that it was so expensive, people were living in cars. And this is not just one person, but family. I can't imagine how you do that. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to put some numbers to the housing since some of your conversation today. We're about 8,800 total downtown, again, units in the downtown area. Regarding the gentleman's question about homelessness, I can kind of give you an example. So our inner loop area where we've developed about 700 to 800 units, 20% of those are housing for definitionally homeless. In total, you've got about, I may be a little bit high on this, but I'm going to tell you it's about 60% are income restricted.
Okay.
So we're after that number. I'm curious, I want you to be a little bit of a futurist, because as you drove around today, you saw a community downtown of, again, 8,800 people. Okay, so we've been after this hardcore 15 years. We've been successful. Our absorption rate's real high. Our vacancy rate's like 4% of downtown housing. What you probably noticed most dramatically is there's no one on the street. And that's because we have probably less, and I'm being conservatively high, I would tell you we have less than 10 retail outlets downtown. We have a bookstore, we have a couple of sneaker shops, and then I'm kind of pressed to get to 10. How do we do that? I mean, why do I want to live downtown when there's no one on the street? Why do you know?
Well, one of the issues is you have a very big downtown. So, I mean, you need to build critical mass somewhere. But what has happened is it's been sort of like whatever comes up. There hasn't been any real planning as to what we should focus on and really intensely focus on.
When you say that, I don't understand what you mean. So across the board, our commercial office space is being turned into housing. That's a given, and our commercial office is is plummeting in a natural way. It kind of goes to the woman's question about retail, and I don't like in a group this large the mythology of a grocery store to be just let go so easily. We have one of the best grocery stores on the planet. If the Wegmans thought that there was a reason economically, very, very generous people, wonderful community givers, to have a store downtown, they would have done it. So clearly, there's just not enough demand, right? There's just not enough reason for them to do that, right? Because like, as you said, I buy a bag of groceries if I'm within walking distance. I get in my car, I'm a mile away from Wegmans. Why would why would I go elsewhere?
Right. Well, it's interesting because the ULI, the Urban Land Institute, has, we're not retail experts, but I know that they've come up with numbers associated with various kinds of retail operations. But when they're talking about those numbers, they're not talking about it spread out by this whole area within the inner loop plus Thornhill plus High Hall. They're talking about maybe the size of Midtown. And so when you have housing happening all over, you really haven't created that critical mass. And you have some really nice narrow streets, but like Clinton, huge. We were walking along it today, right? We were the only 3 people walking.
You bet. Yeah, Harvard just said 10,000.
Yeah.
But that must mean that when we reach 10,000, the doors will flood out.
Well,
Because
it's
it's not-
10,000 closer to dozen.
Yeah.
So, and that's hard to do.
The gentleman said a lot of what I was going to say as far as the housing. I believe any property that is purchased from the city requires a minimum of 20% of the subsidized housing. So those units along North Union, a fair chunk of those are subsidized housing. They may not get down to the homeless rate, but they are subsidized. Okay. Parking. Anybody who's not a member, I invite you to look up the Rochester Urbanists Facebook group. They discuss the city, outlying from the city. There have been discussion threads with facts and figures and aerial pictures. You are dead on. People want their parking space in front of their apartment. They don't want to walk 150 feet. We have many more parking spaces. And I don't mean 10% more than the number of cars that use them. I mean 5 times the number of parking spaces than cars will use them in the city of Rochester. It's a huge number. People are trying to infill those parking spaces to get housing so you can get that demand. And that's all I wanted to say. I wanted to add the other perspective there.
We'll take one more. I'll come over.
Yeah, I have a question, and this is economic development oriented. How can you, real estate is gold in today's economy. People don't collect gold, but there's an awful lot of investors investing and collecting real estate. They buy huge chunks of real estate. They don't even necessarily have to know the city that they're buying the real estate in. It becomes available, they grab it up. Our real estate prices are lower than in most places, but if you've got people from the other side of the country buying Rochester real estate, they're gonna start to hike up the cost of real estate and the housing in our area. And this is, of course, countrywide. So if you've got this uniform real estate investment market affecting uniformly the United States of America,
Right.
you cannot solve the problem of the cost of housing without dealing with that.
Well, that's certainly a significant impact on a lot of neighborhoods. Hedge funds have been, buying up thousands of houses, fixing up just enough, and then renting them for much more than they were rented for.
Or dropping them and letting them go vacant, and then nothing is happening for them, and nobody's living there.
Right. No, I don't know what you can do about that, because, we believe in the ability of people to buy houses regardless of whether they're a hedge fund or an individual. But, those hedge funds are now buying mobile home parks. It's really kind of like the last bastion of affordable housing. And they see it as an asset that can be capitalized. And so they're buying mobile home park, jacking up the rents, and those houses are not mobile. So people have to leave and leave behind everything. It's a disgrace. I find it shocking, but I don't know what you can do about it. You can't, these people have no shame. So there's an investor who does that. I find it really shocking. But I wish there was something we could do. I know in Charlotte, we've done a lot of work in Charlotte, North Carolina, which is a booming city. But, there are several large New York firms buying up a lot of houses in their lower income neighborhoods and essentially driving those people out and renting them as Airbnb, you name it. So it's quite extraordinary, but it's having a terrible, and the city, which is very proactive, they are very proactive, and they can't figure out what they can do. I mean, it's a really difficult issue. But I will stop at some point and done enough. Anybody else? I think, is that it?
Does anybody have any last burning questions? One in the back, and then we'll wrap it up.
You mentioned earlier that mostly singles and couples on the market today. I wonder how many of those are households in the formation stage as opposed to people who many people buy their house before they get the kids.
Sure.
And a companion question is, one of the reasons people don't live in the city is the schools. And I'm sure that's true in a lot of cities. There's some better schools are seen outside the city. Do you address that and have a suggestion for that?
In most cities that we've been in, a lot of the old school buildings are being turned into seniors housing because the school population has dropped dramatically. Not only because there are fewer children being born by today's households, but also because a lot of people would not send their kids to an urban school. Now, I don't know what the real condition of schools are here in Rochester, but I do know that a lot of urban school systems get a really bad rap, and mostly because they're mixed race. And it is a racism issue. Because I remember very clearly working in Norfolk, Virginia, and everybody was talking about this high school. Oh, we'll never send our kids there. So I thought I would just look and see what its standing was. Was it really down at the bottom? And it turned out that that school had some of the highest scores of high schools in the state, but it was mixed race. And so from a lot of perspective, a lot of white people, it could not possibly be as good as the suburban school where all the children were white. So unfortunate, but true.
Please join me in thanking Laurie Volk. Thank you, sir.